Hello, and welcome to this your favorite channel, Edison Explains. Today we'll be talking about how to buy a PC for dummies. Every time we are going to buy a new PC, we usually see a list of specifications like this one, whereas the most important ones are the processor, the RAM memory, and the hard disk drive. In this video, we are going to discuss why they are important, how the computer works, and at the end, I'm going to provide some recommendations that I hope they will be useful when buying a new PC. Inside a computer, you will find a motherboard like this one. This square that you see here is the processor. This one over here is the graphics card integrated in this case. These are the memory slots for the RAM memory, which you can see it better here. And also you will find a hard disk similar to this one. The computer is a machine who understands bits. In other words, it speaks in zeros and ones, like in the Matrix. The computer is like the human body, in which his heart is the processor, or central processing unit. It is in charge of keeping the computer alive. The processor is also in charge of communicating with other devices like the RAM memory, the disk, and any other part in the computer. The main task of a processor is to execute instructions. That means that every time you want to see the picture from your crush, or watch the last video from Maluma Baby, or read those divorce documents, these instructions are translated into ones and zeros so the processor can execute them. The random access memory, and no, I'm not talking about that funk, but the RAM memory is like the short-term memory. If I ask you, what did you have for breakfast today? I hope you remember. But what about 3 years ago or 5 years ago? The random access memory stores parts of programs or daily tasks that the processor executes randomly, so it can become faster and better. The hard disk is the place in which you store your information forever. Those memories that you have from your trip to San Andres, you don't have to remember them over and over again so you don't forget. You store them away and then reference them when you need them. That's how the hard disk works. It keeps the information forever so the processor can go and look for it when he needs it. The read-only memory, or ROM, is like the mechanic memory. For example, if you want to run or want to ride a bicycle, you don't have to learn it every time. You just remember it. That's how the ROM works. It knows how to detect when you type a key or how to send a signal to the monitor, and the processor just have to invoke those functions. Let's see how all the parts interact with a real life example. Let's say you want to watch your favorite musical. The processor or CPU is in charge of orchestrating everything. That means that the processor might go into the hard disk drive and load that video. The RAM memory will store part of the video and the program that you use to play it. And the ROM memory is used by the processor so he can send signals to the monitor. The processor might delegate the image processing to the graphics card because that's an entirely different world. And we have reached our geeky moment. The processor. Its main part is the core. Nowadays, almost all the processors comes with 4 cores, which means that each of them can execute a different instruction at the same time. Also, inside each core, you will find multiple threads, meaning that each core can also perform different tasks at the same time, but those ones are smaller and easy to execute. Let's see it with an example. Let's say that you want to play your musical. Then the task for the core might be to play that video, but the task for the thread might be to locate that video in the hard disk, to show the first screenshot in the monitor, or something like that. There are two main providers out there for processors, without saying that they are the only ones. I'm talking about Intel and AMD. Intel chips its processors based on namings like Core i3, Core i5, or Core i7. The difference between them is not much the number of cores, but the number of threads, meaning that if you buy a Core i7, it will come with more thread processing than the Core i3, even though both have 4 cores. Now let's talk about AMD. They also chips their processors labeled similar to Intel, meaning that you will find AMD Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7, and Ryzen 9. Also, the difference between them are the same ones, the number of threads instead of the number of cores. There is another factor for measuring the performance of a processor, and those are the cycles. A cycle is the amount of time a processor takes for executing a single instruction. For example, write or read information. The amount of cycles that a processor can execute in 1 second is measured in hertz. That's the additional value that you usually see when buying a PC. For example, you can find a Intel Core i3 working at 1.7 GHz or a Core i7 working at 4.5 GHz. All this information means that if you buy a newer processor with more threads, means that you will be able to execute heavier tasks on your computer in a bigger amount. But watch out, you cannot guide yourself only by the processor. It's all the same if you have the most recent processor with a number of cores and threads if your RAM memory cannot handle all that information. Once upon a time, all RAM memories came as SDR, single data rate, the same as all the processor came with just one core and one thread. Now, all the processors comes with at least 4 cores and some threads, and all RAM memories comes with DDR, double data rate. So what does that mean? Single data rate means that you can perform only one operation at a time, either write or read information from the RAM memory. Double data rate means that the processor now can either write and read or read and write at the same time, which improves the speed and the reliability of the RAM memory. Do you remember when I told you that the computer is a machine who understands bits? Meaning that it can talk in ones and zeros? That's the binary system, meaning that the processor works better when you have components in a base 2 number. If you are to choose between a computer with a single RAM memory of 4 GB and another computer with 2 random access memory of 2 GB, I suggest you to go with the second option. Why? The processor works better when he can access multiple memory RAMs at the same time. That improves the speed of the processor and the task that it executes. Now, what about those base 2 numbers that I was saying before? Look at this. 2 GB is the same as 2048 megabytes, is a power of 2. 4 GB is 4096 megabytes, also a power of 2. But 3 GB are equivalent to 3072 megabytes, that is not a power of 2. Also, 5 GB are 5120 megabytes, which is also not a power of 2, meaning that if you choose that option, the processor will have a harder time accessing to them and processing instructions. Finally, let's talk about the hard disk. What is the difference between having an SSD or an HDD disk on your computer? SSD stands for solid state disk and HDD stands for hard disk drive. The difference between the both of them starts with the price. These ones are way more expensive than the classic HDD ones. But why? HDD drives are composed by small disks of memory with pointers. Every time the processor needs to access to the information here, needs to tell that the information about the sector, the disk, and which reader to use. That makes the process more slow and more prone to errors.
On the other hand, the SSD
Solid state disk, on the other hand, works like a case with sodas in which you put a bottle per each cell. In this case, the processor can access the information quicker than in the hard disk drive and in a more reliable way, meaning that it can perform more instructions in a shorter period of time. Now, what happens when you run more than one application at a time and each application is hard consuming or high performance tasks? For example, you are watching a movie in Netflix or you are playing a song in Spotify and at the same time you are editing a picture or a video and at the same time you have a Word document open. That might cope with the RAM capacity. And so what happens then? When there is no more memory RAM, the processor appeals to the hard disk drive and starts storing temporal information so the computer doesn't break down and displays blue screens or gray screens in macOS. This process is called paging. There is another risk dealing with hard disk drives, and that is that they have way too many mechanical parts, meaning that they are more prone to errors due to movements or to faults. That doesn't happen with the solid state disks. They are more robust and you can move them whenever you want. So, when you might prefer the classic hard disk drive, let's say you need lots of storage capacity or you have a desktop computer with a graphic card having 1 gigabyte or more memory or a RAM more than 64 gigabytes of it, or a processor from the last generation with multiple cores and multiple threads, then it might be better if you go with the old way more cheaper and might last longer. Alright, now that we know how a computer works, and if you skip the video until this part, shame on you. But doesn't matter. Now I'm going to provide some suggestions based on my own criteria, hoping that it will be useful for you when buying a new PC. For the beginners, if what you need is to do some work in the cloud, for example, check your work email or access to that document in which you collaborate with your schoolmates, and even if you want to hear some music through Spotify or Deezer, or even watching some videos in YouTube and Netflix, then you don't need that much configuration. For this kind of tasks, it might be enough if you have a processor like a Core i3, a Ryzen 3, or even a Celeron, which is cheaper. On the other hand, you don't need that much RAM memory, so 2 gigabytes or more are good enough. As for storage capacity, you don't need that much since you will be working mostly in the cloud. But if you want to store some information, I suggest a hard disk from 100 gigabytes or more. There are some brands which are not defined by the specifications on their parts, but the function that they perform. We are talking about computers like Chromebooks or MacBook Air, which for this category are good enough as well. For the office workers. Now, if besides those cloud working, you also need to create some spreadsheets or documents or book something in your calendar, or even connect to external devices like a USB memory, a tablet, or a smartphone, then you might need a little more configuration. In this case, we might go as well with a Core i3 or better, a Ryzen 3 or a Celeron processor for this kind of tasks. At the RAM level, I suggest to have a little bit more, starting from 4 gigabytes, since you are going to process something in your actual computer. And finally, for storage, I suggest to have a 200 gigabyte disks. And if you plan to move frequently with your computer, then I suggest you buy a solid state disk. For this kind of tasks, the MacBook Air works pretty well as well, but the Chromebook might be enough if your interaction with external devices are not that significant. for the creative ones. If besides working in the cloud and working with your office stuff, you also get creative from time to time and edit some images or some videos or even code some applications, then we need a little more capabilities in your PC. For this category, I suggest having a Core i5 or a Ryzen 5 or better processor. At the RAM memory, I suggest having 8 gigabytes or more, and at the hard disk drive, at least 260 gigabytes. As for the brand specific computers, I suggest having at least a MacBook Air. For the professionals, if your kind of work is more specialized or requires more performance, for example, if you need to edit images and videos more frequently, code applications, or gaming, then your computer requires the best specifications out there. For this PC, you might point to the best processor out there, which in this case is the Core i7 or the Ryzen 9, but that can change with the time. Also for RAM memory, I suggest at least to have 16 gigabytes of memory. If you can more, the better. And finally, for the hard disk drive, I suggest to have at least 500 gigabytes of storage capacity. There are also big brand names that covers these requirements. For example, Alienware specializes in building PCs for gamers, and MacBook Pro or iMac also supplies this kind of behavior. Because of the nature of this kind of work, I suggest to have at least one extra monitor with 60 Hz of refresh. Also, if you work mostly in the graphics area, then I suggest you have a graphic card. NVIDIA or ATI are good options here. Because these are specialized tasks, then you need to make an important decision at the operating system level. For example, if you love gaming, then maybe the best fit for you is Windows. On the other hand, if you work in the graphics area and you need to edit images or video or render AutoCAD projects, then maybe the best choice for you will be Mac OS. And lastly, if you do some low-level work or you work coding applications, then maybe the best choice for you will be Linux. This selection of the operating system is not only a problem for this category, but for all of them. But it's a complex topic, so I suggest you visit my previous video about operating system. I'm going to share it over here somewhere so you can have a better understanding about it. And that's it. Smash like and subscribe, comment and post any question that you might have. I will try to answer that, and keep supporting me so I can keep explaining stuff.
So, when might you prefer the classic
Ay.
hard disk